Rimbey-Rocky Mountain House-Sundre.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is with great sadness that I rise today to speak on behalf of the constituents of Rimbey-Rocky Mountain House-Sundre against Bill 6, the so-called Enhanced Protection for Farm and Ranch Workers Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, I say with sadness because I'm so very disappointed. And I don't have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, but in this current NDP government, which has chosen to force through this legislation, Mr. Speaker, without proper consultation. Now, I never in my wildest dreams, Mr. Speaker, thought that a day would come in Alberta where a government would so blindly ignore our critical farm and ranch communities and force through wide-sweeping legislation without even taking the time to talk with the farmers and ranchers that it affects. This current government in particular, in my view, Mr. Speaker, should be ashamed because it was elected in part due to public anger over the previous government's frequent use of similar practices. Now, Mr. Speaker, these duck and cover tactics in support of blind ideological belief tend to breed turmoil, and I think we're seeing it now across the province. And now I must say, Mr. Speaker, I'm heartbroken to report that in the case of both my communities back home in my riding, as well as communities across the province, this is the case. Traveling back home this past weekend to my constituency, I was shocked to hear from my own children that kids in elementary classrooms are worried about what this government's policies mean for them, mean for their families, mean for their parents' livelihoods, and mean for their homes. Mr. Speaker, my kids are getting phone calls and emails from their friends begging them to ask their dad to make the government listen. While it's great to see youth engaged with the political process, I wish it was under much better circumstances, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is just one indication of the level of frustration and fear among our farm and ranch families. Every community I stopped in while back home this weekend, I heard the same thing. Mr. Speaker, people are mad. They're shocked and extremely concerned about this government's move to force this legislation through this House in less than 2 weeks and into law within a month. And it's not just farmers and ranchers, Mr. Speaker, who are worried. It's entire communities, from Coffee Road to church parking lots. The people of our communities know just how important farmers and ranchers are. We're proud of them, Mr. Speaker, and we stand with them. Our farmers and ranchers are rightfully outraged that no one has talked to them about this bill. They are furious that these so-called town hall meetings where the government claims consultation that is supposed to be taking place but have not happened in any meaningful way. Instead, these meetings have featured bureaucrats telling farmers and ranchers how it's going to be. Now, Mr. Speaker, does that sound like consultation? Displays set up to provide information on the new law and rules, yet no opportunity for stakeholders to speak or ask questions. Again, does that sound like consultation, Mr. Speaker? Farmers and ranchers are demanding better. True consultation demands better than handing out brochures, patting people on the head, and pledging to help them set up WCB accounts. My constituents back home and the hundreds of Albertans who are contacting my offices from across the province are infuriated that this government has asked this Assembly to put through a piece of legislation that is essentially a blank check. Mr. Speaker, that is exactly what this bill accomplishes when it imposes OH&S on the entire agriculture sector without providing any OH&S agriculture standards. What will these codes entail, Mr. Speaker? Nobody knows. Essentially, this government is saying, hey, just trust us. We'll fix the things you're worried about after we pass the law. Mr. Speaker, this is a ridiculous miscarriage of the legislative process and an affront to the oaths we have taken as servants elected to represent public interests. There simply can be no major advancement in farm safety or on any other major policy initiative the government demands when they're asking for blind trust and no consultation from the people it affects. The hard truth is, at the time of the last general election, the vast majority of people in my riding did not trust this government. That's the truth, Mr. Speaker. This certainly has not changed in the past 6 months, which has seen this government systematically attack every employer, large and small, in every major economic sector. Yet blind trust with this bill is what this government is demanding. Since this bill was announced, the government has systematically denied that any and all concerns raised by the public are valid. Rather than engage, discuss, or consult, the government chose to immediately leap into fear and smear mode. We have witnessed the Premier of Alberta stand up in this assembly in front of all of us and accuse farmers and ranchers of forcing people to do unsafe work. She said she was trying to rectify this great wrong that has been taking place in Alberta. Does she really think, Mr. Speaker, that farmers and ranchers have been systematically forcing our friends and neighbors to do unsafe work? Tasks that these folks are pleading not to do? Does she really think so low of farmers and ranchers? Whether she truly believes this or not, or is just cranking up her ridiculous rhetoric, she really needs to get out of her office and meet the farmers and ranchers of this great province. Because, Mr. Speaker, they are some of the finest people this province and country have to offer. Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, the Premier's rhetoric has become unnecessarily provocative. To gain support for her government's actions, she has cast farmers and ranchers in a poor light, turning Albertans against Albertans. I'm willing to concede that that is perhaps not her intention, but this government needs to understand the consequences of implying that farmers and ranchers are improperly or selfishly motivated. Farmers and ranchers are proud of their operations and remain committed to the safety and well-being of all who work and live on their land. These farms are also their homes, and no one desires any less than the best for his or her family. This Premier and this government certainly should apologize to farmers and ranchers for the unfortunate rhetoric being produced, as well as trying to force this bill through the legislature without proper consultation. Now, Mr. Speaker, through you, I challenge the Premier to stand up right now and admit she got it wrong. Admit that this process is hopelessly flawed, and at the very least, send this bill to committee for proper consultation. Mr. Speaker, she should stand up and make it clear that she is going to ensure that family farms are protected like they are in other provinces. She should stand up and make it clear that she will make sure kids' agriculture involvement will be protected. Perhaps most importantly, Mr. Speaker, she should make clear that all of the OH&S and employment standards will be fully transparent and completed in full before this bill proceeds, so farmers, ranchers, 4-H clubs, rural communities, and all Albertans know exactly what this legislation will require. I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker, demanding blind trust without consultation is a recipe for disaster. In fact, as soon as I saw this bill from this government, I knew trouble was brewing. I knew folks at home would be upset, that hundreds of thousands of Albertans would be livid. The sad part is that this government is so out of touch with some parts of this province that they simply did not know. They really didn't see it coming. They only saw things from their own point of view and had no idea how entire communities could be so upset, so hurt, and so angry. And I believe the word for that, Mr. Speaker, is arrogance. They didn't realize that this would anger even more people than the former government's horrific property rights bills a few years back. In less than a week, I've received more than 1,000 phone calls on this issue, and more letters and emails than I can count, and they're still coming in even as we sit here. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is simply unacceptable. This government would be wise to step back from this course of action and commit to working with the communities affected to get this right. The bottom line, Mr. Speaker, is the government's campaign of misinformation against ranchers and farmers is not making anyone safer. The folks who can actually take concrete action to improve safety are farmers and ranchers, Mr. Speaker, and they're willing to help, but they cannot get anywhere with those who refuse to take into account what real life is like on a farm or ranch. In short, they want this government to work with them. Why won't the government work with them, Mr. Speaker? It is an affront to them when they see this government take steps to ram this legislation through the process. They aren't stupid, Mr. Speaker. They know that provincial and federal governments regularly send bills to committee to allow expert testimony and consultation. They have seen this government send matters to committee, ensuring legislation is well thought out and that any and all ramifications have been addressed. They know that this NDP government, Mr. Speaker, put together a special committee on ethics and accountability and has sent relatively simple private member bills to committee for review. Farmers and ranchers know all of this, and they're asking why Bill 6 is different. And I have nothing to tell them, Mr. Speaker. The fact is, Bill 6 is the most wide-ranging and important piece of legislation ever written with respect to agriculture in this province. Depending on how the OH&S and employment standards are written, this bill could end the concept of family farming as we know it, Mr. Speaker. Yet this government can't see fit to send this bill to committee and ensure farmers have an opportunity to consult. For shame, Mr. Speaker. For shame. Mr. Speaker, through you, shame on this Premier, who promised a better approach to the legislative process And shame on these rural MLAs and this NDP caucus who are not stopping this behavior by this government for their constituents. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know they're getting the same calls and the same emails I am about this bill. I know the bulk of their constituents are saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm sure of this because the same folks are calling me for help. Their constituents are calling me for help. They're calling my colleagues for help. Now think about that, Mr. Speaker. I challenge them, through you, Mr. Speaker, all NDP rural MLAs to stand up in this Assembly and explain why they think Bill 6 needs to be forced through with no consultation. I ask them, through you, Mr. Speaker, to explain to their constituents how the so-called town halls are in any way adequate. I challenge them, through you, Mr. Speaker, to explain why they think farmers and ranchers should blindly trust bureaucrats to protect family farming. I ask them, through you, Mr. Speaker, to stand up and explain. And if they cannot, then do their darn jobs and stand up to the government. Mr. Speaker, through you, I remind them that they are supposed to represent constituents' views on these bills and make sure that constituents' views and interests are on their minds first and foremost, not their premiers. Mr. Speaker, they need to explain right now why this bill has to pass this House at lightning speed. Because, Mr. Speaker, I guarantee you, they will face questions during the election, not to mention every single day between now and then. This will not just go away, Mr. Speaker. Duck and cover is not a legitimate long-term option on this one. Now, I understand some of them, Mr. Speaker, are conflicted with the orders from the Premier's office, and I truly hope they reach for the courage necessary to stand up against this. However, Mr. Speaker, in the past, we have seen government backbenchers choose to toe the line, abandon integrity, and cling to talking points. Now, I certainly hope that is not the case here because the government's talking points on Bill 6 are truly ridiculous. Now, how ridiculous, Mr. Speaker, is it to ask Albertans to trust this government after it attempts to force major legislation through the process without talking to farmers or ranchers? How ridiculous, Mr. Speaker, is it to refer to these town hall meetings and consultation when there's no dialogue other than to seek advice on when it would be most advantageous for unions to strike on farms? That's consultation? How ridiculous is it to say consultations isn't necessary because the previous government consulted 4 or 5 years ago? The fact is, Mr. Speaker, thousands of farmers are coming forward right now, and they're telling us they want their say, and no one from this government has bothered to ask their opinion. This flawed argument also ignores the fact that the last government chose education over legislation precisely because it did consult. Now, Mr. Speaker, we're going to talk a lot about this in the coming days, particularly as we committee of the whole. But with the limited time I have left to speak to second reading, I want to talk about why this matters. This bill in its current format hurts family farms. It hurts farming, it hurts ranches, it hurts rural communities. You see, in Alberta, farming is primarily a family enterprise. Only a small percentage of all farms and ranches sell more than $500,000 a year. These farms and ranches are not just places for work, they are homes. And the people who live in these homes are not just farming as a job, but as a way of life. It is who they are. It is their family's identity. It is who their neighbors are. And it is crucial to their community. Representatives of this government like to stand and accuse farmers and ranchers of forcing people to do unsafe work and say that all other provinces have the same legislation. Now, what they do not tell you, Mr. Speaker, is that other provinces also protect the family farm, and this bill does no such thing. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've heard some vague promises over the weekend as farmers and ranchers begin to register their anger about this government considering steps to protect family farms after the bill passes. I have not found one person in my riding willing to entrust the future of their home and their livelihood to the empty promises of this government. Mr. Speaker, they need this bill to provide 100% ironclad protection for family farms immediately upon implementation of this bill, and anything else is unacceptable. The success of family farms relies on the help of not only the family, but of the entire community. As a farmer from my community wrote to me, and I quote, "When family farms have a major project, everyone pitches in. The neighbors and friends and families pitch in. We do not pay each other, we help each other out." Let me please say that again. We do not pay each other, we help each other out. This is one of the greatest aspects of farm life, the tremendous community support system we get to enjoy. This may not make sense to people from the city, but it is because of this great support system that small farms and ranches are able to exist and keep costs to a minimum. Many hands, Mr. Speaker, make light work. Mr. Speaker, what will this legislation mean for the way that family farms are operated and how they interact with their neighbors? Under Bill 6, OH&S applies to volunteers, and it will have an impact. There's nothing in this bill that says otherwise. Pass this bill as currently worded without a fully written employment standards OH&S, and you risk attacking the very foundation of the family farm. Mr. Speaker, full stop.